In the dying light of autumn 1901, when the Oklahoma Territory still bore the scars of recent settlement and the wounds of displacement ran deep through the red earth, there existed a town that history would soon forget, not through neglect, not through the passage of time, but through deliberate erasure from the very fabric of reality itself. This town was called Ash Hollow, and it harbored a secret so profound, so terrible, that 13 families would choose to vanish rather than allow it to see the light of day. The story begins not with the disappearance itself, but with the founding of Ash Hollow 27 years earlier. In the harsh winter of 1874, the original settlers were not the typical pioneers seeking fortune or fertile land. They were religious dissenters, outcasts from established Christian denominations who had developed beliefs so radical, so fundamentally opposed to conventional theology, that they had been driven from settlement after settlement across the expanding frontier. Their leader was a man named Ezekiel Thorne, a former Methodist minister who had experienced what he called the Great Revelation. During a fever dream in Kansas, Thorne claimed that traditional Christianity had misunderstood the nature of divine judgment. The second coming, he preached, would not arrive with trumpets and glory, but with absolute silence. God's final judgment would be the withdrawal of His presence entirely, leaving humanity in perfect, eternal quiet. This doctrine, which Thorne called the theology of sacred absence, attracted followers who had grown disillusioned with the promises of conventional religion. They believed that by practicing rituals of silence and darkness, by deliberately removing themselves from God's attention, they could achieve a form of salvation through divine neglect. It was better, Thorne taught, to be ignored by God than to face His wrath. The 13 families who followed Thorne to the desolate valley that would become Ash Hollow were bound together not just by shared belief, but by shared trauma. Each family carried wounds from their past lives: children lost to disease, crops destroyed by drought, dreams shattered by economic collapse. They saw in Thorne's teachings not just spiritual guidance, but practical wisdom. If God's attention brought suffering, then perhaps His absence would bring peace. The land they chose for their settlement was itself scarred and strange. The valley lay between two low ridges of red sandstone, creating a natural depression that seemed to swallow sound and light. Local Creek and Cherokee tribes had avoided the area for generations, calling it the place where the earth dreams badly. Early surveyors noted unusual mineral deposits in the soil, high concentrations of sulfur and iron oxide that gave the ground its distinctive red-black color, and the persistent smell of burnt metal. But the settlers saw these oddities as signs of divine favor. The sulfur reminded them of biblical descriptions of God's judgment, while the iron-rich soil, though poor for farming, seemed to insulate their community from the outside world. Radio signals wouldn't penetrate the valley. Compass needles spun wildly within its borders. Even birds seemed reluctant to fly overhead, creating a dome of perpetual quiet that the settlers interpreted as sacred silence. Construction of Ash Hollow proceeded. According to Thorne's specific theological requirements, no building could have more than 3 windows, as 4 was considered the number of divine presence. All doors faced inward toward the center of town, never toward the horizon where God's light might enter. The church, built last and with the greatest care, was designed as an inverse cathedral. Its spire pointed downward into a basement sanctuary. Its windows were painted black, and its bell was cast from the iron-rich soil of the valley itself, creating a tone so deep and mournful that it seemed to absorb rather than project sound. The daily life of Ash Hollow was governed by increasingly complex rituals of avoidance. Mirrors were forbidden, as reflections might catch divine attention. Residents spoke in whispers during daylight hours and observed complete silence. From sunset to sunrise, children were given shadow names at birth, false identities used in public while their true names were known only to their immediate families and never spoken aloud. After their 9th birthday, the most unsettling practice was the monthly breathing halt observed on the 13th day of each month, from midnight until dawn. The entire population of Ash Hollow would hold their breath for precisely 13 seconds at a time, believing that rhythmic breathing might create patterns that could attract divine notice. Visitors reported the eerie Sight of an entire town periodically frozen in absolute stillness, like a clockwork settlement wound down and waiting to resume motion. As the years passed, these practices intensified rather than diminished. What began as theological observances evolved into something approaching collective madness. Children born in Ash Hollow after 1880 showed disturbing characteristics. They rarely cried, even as infants, and seemed to instinctively understand the community's complex silence rituals without instruction. They aged differently too, remaining small and pale well into adolescence, as if the absence of normal childhood joy had stunted their physical development. Along with their emotional growth, the adults fared no better. Prolonged silence and sensory deprivation began to take psychological tolls that the community interpreted as spiritual progress. Residents reported vivid dreams of vast empty spaces and speaking in tongues during their sleep, though always in whispers. Some developed a condition they called the gray sight, claiming they could see shadowy figures moving through the town during daylight hours. Figures that cast no shadows themselves and seemed to exist in the spaces between seconds. By 1895, Ash Hollow had achieved a reputation throughout the Oklahoma Territory as a place of profound unease. Traveling salesmen would detour miles out of their way to avoid passing through the valley. The Postal Service required hazard pay for mail, carriers assigned to the route. Even hardened frontier preachers, men who had faced down cattle rustlers and Indian raiding parties, refused invitations to minister to the community, claiming they felt spiritually nauseous whenever they approached the town limits. The isolation might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of a new resident in the spring of 1900. Sarah Whitmore was a young widow from Missouri whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with a 5-year-old daughter named Mabel and no means of support. Desperate and drawn by Ezekiel Thorne's promises of a community that welcomed the dispossessed, she made the journey to Ash Hollow with her life's possessions packed into a single trunk. Sarah's arrival marked the beginning of the end for Ash Hollow, though none of the residents realized it at the time, unlike the original settlers, who had joined the community. As adults already committed to its strange theology, Sarah brought with her a child who had known normal life. Little Mabel Whitmore had laughed and played and spoken freely for the first 5 years of her existence. The transition to Ash Hollow's oppressive silence was traumatic in ways that would echo through the decades to come. Mabel struggled to adapt to the community's requirements. She forgot to whisper during daylight hours. She instinctively reached for mirrors that weren't there. Most troubling of all, she asked questions, endless, innocent questions about why they lived the way they did, questions that forced the adults to confront the fundamental arbitrariness of many of their practices. Ezekiel Thorne, now in his 70s and increasingly frail, saw Mabel's difficulty adapting as evidence of spiritual contamination. He began to preach that the community's perfect silence had been broken by the introduction of an unquiet soul, and that divine attention was once again turning toward Ash Hollow. Strange phenomena began to manifest with increasing frequency. Tools would be found rearranged in perfect geometric patterns overnight. Animals would be discovered frozen in unnatural poses along the town's perimeter, and residents reported hearing whispered conversations in languages that predated human speech. The psychological pressure on Sarah Whitmore was immense. Desperate to protect her daughter and secure their place in the only community that had offered them sanctuary, she imposed increasingly harsh silence disciplines on the child. Mabel was forbidden to speak at all during the day and locked in the root cellar. During the monthly breathing halt observances, the other residents, initially sympathetic to the widow's plight, began to view mother and daughter with suspicion and resentment. It was during the winter of 1900 that Ezekiel Thorne received what he would later describe as his final revelation. Weakened by age and decades of ritual fasting, Thorne claimed to have achieved a state of perfect spiritual emptiness during a particularly intensive silence observance. In this state, he said, he had encountered the true nature of the divine presence that had been watching Ash Hollow since its founding. What Thorne described to his followers was not the absent God they had been avoiding, but something far older and more alien. He spoke of an intelligence that existed in the spaces between thoughts, that fed on silence and grew stronger in the absence of prayer. This entity, which he refused to name directly, had been drawn to Ash Hollow, not repelled by their practices. Their rituals of avoidance had created the perfect environment for something that thrived on spiritual vacuum. The revelation shattered the community's understanding of their purpose. For 26 years, they had believed they were achieving salvation through divine neglect. Now their leader told them they had been nurturing something that was decidedly not divine, something that had been growing stronger with each year of their observances. The entity, Thorn claimed, was nearly mature enough to manifest physically in their world, and when it did, Ash Hollow would become its permanent gateway. But Thorn offered a solution, one final ritual that could seal the breach they had unwittingly opened. The Pact of Sacred Sacrifice would require the willing participation of 13 families, one for each year. The entity had been feeding on their silence. These families would offer themselves not to God, but to the void itself, becoming permanent guardians at the threshold between worlds. In exchange, the entity would remain contained within the valley, unable to spread beyond Ash Hollow's borders. The proposal split the community along lines that had been building for months. The original 12 families, bound together by decades of shared belief and mutual dependence, accepted Thorn's logic without question. They had invested too much in their strange theology to abandon it now, even faced with evidence that their entire worldview had been fundamentally mistaken. But Sarah Whitmore, still new to the community and protective of her daughter, refused to participate. The debate that followed was conducted in whispers and coded gestures, but its intensity was unmistakable. Sarah argued that they should abandon Ash Hollow entirely, relocate to a normal community where they could practice conventional Christianity. The other families countered that the entity would follow them wherever they went, that only the ritual sacrifice could contain it. Besides, where could they go? They had been outcasts and wanderers. Before finding Ash Hollow, the outside world had no place for people who had lived as they had lived. As spring turned to summer in 1901, the psychological pressure in Ash Hollow became almost unbearable. Residents reported shared nightmares of a vast mouth opening in the earth beneath the town, swallowing houses and families while leaving no trace of their existence. Children, particularly Mabel Whitmore, began showing signs of severe psychological distress, mutism, obsessive behaviors, and an unnatural fear of daylight that kept them huddled in dark corners even during permitted speaking hours. The entity's influence grew stronger as well. Objects would disappear for days before reappearing in impossible locations, buried in gardens, embedded in walls, suspended in midair above the church altar. The town's water supply developed a metallic taste that reminded residents of blood. Most disturbing of all, people began to forget things, not major memories, but small details that helped define individual identity. Residents would struggle to remember their birth dates, the names of distant relatives, or the specific circumstances that had brought them to Ash Hollow. Ezekiel Thorne, functioning now more as a conduit for the entity than as a traditional religious leader, began preparing the Pact of Sacred Sacrifice in earnest, working from medieval texts that had somehow found their way into his possession. He designed a ritual that would bind 13 families to the entity in permanent service. The sacrifice would not involve physical death, he explained, but something far more profound, a voluntary erasure from the stream of human existence. The families who agreed to participate would simply cease to have ever existed. Their names would fade from memory, their deeds would be forgotten, and their physical forms would become part of the entity's manifestation in the mortal world. It was, Thorne claimed, the ultimate expression of their theology of sacred absence, not just hiding from God's attention, but erasing themselves from creation entirely. The ritual required specific preparations that consumed the entire summer of 1901. Each participating family had to construct a memory box containing objects that represented their earthly attachments, photographs, letters, keepsakes that connected them to their former lives. These boxes would be buried at precise locations around the valley, creating a containment circle that would define the entity's domain. The families themselves had to undergo increasingly intensive purification rituals, fasting and silence observances that left them weak and disoriented, more susceptible to the entity's influence. Sarah Whitmore watched these preparations with growing horror. She had initially hoped that the other families would come to their senses, that someone would voice the obvious objection, that the entire plan sounded like elaborate suicide. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that the community was fully committed to Thorne's vision. Even worse, she began to suspect that the entity's influence was affecting her as well. She found herself forgetting details of her life before Ash Hollow, struggling to remember her husband's face or the sound of Mabel's laughter from before their arrival. The breaking point came in early September when Thorne announced that the ritual would require a witness, someone to remain behind and record the family's willing sacrifice for posterity. This witness would be spared the entity's appetite, but would be bound to silence about what they had seen, condemned to carry the secret until their natural death. Thorne's gaze fell on Sarah Whitmore as he spoke, making it clear that she and her daughter were intended for this role. Sarah's refusal was immediate and absolute. She had no intention of watching 13 families destroy themselves, or of allowing her daughter to be traumatized by such a spectacle. But her options were severely limited. The community had become increasingly hostile toward her dissent, and she suspected that they might be willing to use force to ensure her cooperation. The nearest town was 30 miles away across difficult terrain, and she had no means of transportation beyond her own feet. It was Mabel herself who provided the solution, though she was too young to understand the full implications of her suggestion. The child had discovered a network of natural caves in the hills surrounding Ash Hollow, caves that seemed to extend far beyond the valley's borders. If they could hide in the caves during the ritual, Mabel reasoned with the logic of a 6-year-old, they could wait until the bad thing went away and then leave safely. Sarah realized that the caves might indeed offer a way out of the valley that wouldn't require passing through the town itself. But she also understood that once the ritual was complete, she and Mabel could never return to normal society. They would carry knowledge of what had happened in Ash Hollow, and Thorne had made it clear that the entity's influence extended beyond the valley's physical boundaries. They would need to disappear as completely as the 13 families, though through flight rather than mystical erasure. The final weeks before the ritual were a nightmare of preparation and concealment. Sarah had to maintain the appearance of reluctant cooperation while secretly gathering supplies. For an extended journey through wilderness terrain, she cached food and water in the caves, along with warm clothing and tools that might help them survive until they could reach civilization. Most critically, she had to keep her plans hidden from Mabel, who had begun showing signs of the same psychological deterioration affecting the other children in Ash Hollow. The night chosen for the Pact of Sacred Sacrifice was October 13, 1901, a date selected for its numerological significance in the entity's manifestation cycle. The ritual was to begin at midnight and continue until dawn, timed to coincide with the darkest hours when the barrier between worlds was thinnest. Sarah's plan was to slip away with Mabel during the evening's preparatory observances, while the other families were focused on their final purifications. But the entity had been aware of her intentions all along. As Sarah crept through the town toward the caves where she had hidden their supplies, she found her way blocked by figures she initially mistook for other residents. Only when she approached more closely did she realize that these were not the people of Ash Hollow, but something else wearing their shapes, shadows with substance, reflections without mirrors, echoes of human form that moved within human coordination. The confrontation that followed was less a physical struggle than a battle of wills. The entity, speaking through multiple voices in perfect unison, offered Sarah a choice. She could witness the ritual as originally planned, recording the willing sacrifice of 13 families and preserving their memory, even as they were erased from existence. Or she could join them in the Pact, bringing the number of participating families to 14 and completing a more perfect binding that would contain the entity for centuries rather than decades. Sarah's response was to grab Mabel and run, not toward the caves but directly out of the valley through the town center. It was a desperate gamble based on her observation that the entity's influence seemed strongest in the shadows and hidden places. The main street of Ash Hollow, illuminated by the full moon and free of obstructions, might offer a corridor of escape that even the entity couldn't block. Her theory proved partially correct. The shadow figures couldn't manifest in the direct moonlight, forced to retreat to doorways and alleys as Sarah carried her daughter through the heart of town. But the entity had other resources at its disposal. The residents of Ash Hollow, the very families preparing for their willing sacrifice, emerged from their homes to block Sarah's escape. What followed was a chase that would haunt Sarah Whitmore for the rest of her life. 13 families, including children she had known and cared for, pursued her and Mabel through the streets with implacable determination. They moved with unnatural coordination, their whispered voices creating a chorus of condemnation that seemed to come from the earth itself. They spoke not of stopping her escape, but of completing the ritual, of fulfilling the promise that had sustained their community for 27 years. Sarah reached the edge of town just as the church bell began to toll midnight, not the usual deep, mournful tone, but a sound that seemed to ring backwards through time, calling not to the living, but to the spaces between existence. Behind her, the residents of Ash Hollow had gathered in the street, no longer pursuing, but simply watching as she stumbled into the darkness beyond their domain. She did not look back. For 3 days, Sarah carried Mabel through wilderness terrain, guided only by the stars and her desperate need to put distance between them and the valley. They survived on cached supplies and stream water, moving constantly to stay ahead of the influence that seemed to follow them like a cold wind. Not until they reached the town of Broken Arrow did Sarah dare to stop, and even then she told no one where they had come from or what they had seen. The official investigation into the disappearance of Ash Hollow began on October 16, 1901, when mail carrier Bernard Kessel arrived for his monthly delivery, to find the town completely abandoned. Kessel was a practical man, a Civil War veteran who had seen his share of tragedy and strangeness on the frontier. But what he found in Ash Hollow defied his ability to rationalize or explain. The town showed no signs of violence or struggle. Tables were set for meals that had never been eaten. Beds bore the impressions of bodies that had vanished in their sleep. Children's toys lay scattered in precisely the positions where they had been dropped, as if their owners had simply evaporated mid-play. Most disturbing of all, personal belongings remained untouched: jewelry, money, photographs, all the things that refugees would certainly have taken if they had fled by choice. Kessel's investigation led him inevitably to the church, where he found the massive ledger that would become the central mystery of the Ash Hollow disappearance. The book lay open on the pulpit, its pages illuminated by shafts of colored light streaming through the painted windows. The first 13 pages contain signatures written in identical black ink, names that Kessel recognized as belonging to the town's founding families, though he noticed immediately that some names seemed to be fading even as he read them. Each signature was accompanied by a red wax seal, pressed with the image of an inverted cross, still warm to the touch despite the church's cool interior. Below the final signature, written in the same black ink but in a different hand, was the phrase that would puzzle investigators for decades: by faith or by fire. The covenant is sealed. But it was the 14th page that truly unsettled Kessel. Unlike the others, it bore no signature, only the impression of a seal that had been pressed into the wax and then immediately removed, leaving a hollow depression that seemed to draw light into itself. Beside this absent seal, in handwriting that appeared to shift and change even as he watched, were the words, "The witness remains, the 13th family lives, the binding holds." Kessel's report to territorial authorities triggered the most intensive investigation in Oklahoma's pre-statehood history. Teams of federal marshals, territorial administrators, and civilian experts descended on Ash Hollow seeking rational explanations for what appeared to be a mass disappearance without precedent. They found evidence of the community's strange religious practices: the painted windows, the inverted church architecture, the complex silence rituals documented in personal diaries left behind in various homes. But they also found evidence of something far more disturbing. Geological surveys revealed that the mineral composition of the valley's soil had changed dramatically in recent months, with sulfur concentrations so high that they should have been toxic to plant and animal life. Yet vegetation in the area showed no signs of contamination, growing with unusual vigor despite the hostile soil conditions. More troubling still, magnetic readings throughout the valley fluctuated wildly, as if some massive source of electromagnetic interference was buried beneath the town. The investigation team also discovered the memory boxes that each family had. Buried around the valley's perimeter, these containers held personal belongings, photographs, and written documents that provided the clearest picture of the family's histories and motivations. Reading through letters and diary entries, investigators began to piece together the development of Ezekiel Thorne's theology and the events leading up to the mysterious disappearance. But the memory boxes also contained items that shouldn't have. Existed photographs showing people who weren't in any official records, documents written in languages that linguistic experts couldn't identify, and artifacts that appeared to predate the town's founding by centuries. Most disturbing of all were the photographs that seemed to show the same people, at different ages simultaneously, or images of the town itself taken from impossible angles, as if the camera had been positioned in mid-air or underground. As weeks turned to months, the official investigation began to focus on the possibility of mass migration, the theory that the entire community had simply decided to relocate to a different territory. But this explanation faced insurmountable obstacles. No trace of the Ash Hollow residents could be found in any neighboring settlements. No purchases of supplies or transportation could be documented. Most conclusively, genealogical research revealed that the bloodlines of all 13 families had simply terminated. In 1901, with no descendants or collateral relatives appearing anywhere in subsequent records, the ledger itself became the focus of increasingly desperate attempts at rational explanation. Handwriting experts confirmed that the 13 signatures were genuine, matching samples found in the family's personal documents. But they also noted anomalies that defied conventional analysis. Ink that seemed to have been applied from the inside of the paper outward, pen strokes that showed no evidence of normal hand movement, and wax seals that contained organic compounds not found in any known wax formulation. More disturbing still were the changes that occurred in the ledger over time. Investigators who returned to examine it weeks or months later found that the signatures had continued to fade, not through normal aging, but in a pattern that suggested deliberate erasure. By 1905, several names had become completely illegible, and by 1910, only shadows remained where the signatures had been. The red wax seals, however, remained as bright and fresh as the day Bernard Kessel had first discovered them. The 14th page continued to puzzle investigators throughout the extended inquiry. Various attempts were made to analyze the hollow impression left by the missing seal, using techniques ranging from plaster casting to photographic enhancement. But every method produced the same result: an absence so complete that it seemed to actively resist documentation. Cameras focused on the page would develop blank spots in the developed film. Plaster poured into the impression would flow through it as if the page were permeable, yet leave no trace of its passage. By 1915, the official investigation had been quietly closed and its files sealed under territorial security provisions. The valley that had once held Ash Hollow was surveyed and platted for agricultural development, but no buyers could be found for land that seemed to actively discourage habitation. Crops planted in the valley's soil would grow with unnatural vigor before withering suddenly, as if something beneath the ground was drawing away their life force. Livestock pastured in the area would refuse to enter certain portions of the valley, clustering together in tight groups and showing signs of extreme distress. The few attempts at resettlement were brief and unsuccessful. Families who tried to establish homesteads in the valley reported persistent nightmares, unexplained illnesses, and the gradual loss of personal memories. Children were particularly affected, becoming listless and withdrawn, speaking in whispers even when no silence was required. Most families abandoned their claims within months, forfeiting significant investments rather than continue living in what they described as a place where hope goes to die. Throughout this period, Sarah Whitmore and her daughter Mabel lived in hiding under assumed names, moving frequently to stay ahead of the influence that continued to follow them. Sarah had initially hoped that distance and time would free them from Ash Hollow's effects, but she gradually realized that their status as witnesses made them permanent targets of the entity's attention. The memory loss that had begun in the valley continued to accelerate, eating away at her recollections of life before their arrival in the cursed town. Mabel's condition was even more troubling. The child aged slowly and erratically, remaining physically small while developing an adult understanding of their situation. That was deeply unsettling. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was often to share knowledge she couldn't possibly possess, details about the entity's nature, predictions about where they needed to go next to stay safe, and most disturbingly, quotations from the missing pages of Ezekiel Thorne's theological writings. By 1920, Sarah had developed the routine that would sustain them for the next 27 years. They would establish temporary residence in small towns throughout the Southwest, staying long enough to earn money for supplies, but never long enough to form lasting connections. Sarah worked as a seamstress, housekeeper, or agricultural labor jobs that required minimal documentation and allowed her to maintain her cover identity. Mabel was educated sporadically when they could find communities that would accept a child with no official records. The entity's pursuit never ceased entirely, but it seemed to operate under certain limitations that Sarah gradually learned to exploit. It was strongest during the 13th day of each month, requiring them to be in motion and surrounded by other people during these vulnerable periods. It had difficulty manifesting in areas with strong religious communities, though it seemed to draw power from places where faith had been corrupted or abandoned. Most importantly, it could not directly harm them as long as they remembered their true identities and maintained their connection to the world beyond Ash Hollow. This last point became increasingly difficult as the years passed. The memory loss that had begun in the valley continued its slow progression, erasing not just recollections of their former life, but fundamental aspects of their personalities. Sarah found herself forgetting her husband's name, then his face, then eventually the fact that she had ever been married at all. Mabel's condition was more complex. She retained perfect memory of everything that had happened since leaving Ash Hollow, but her recollections of her earliest childhood became confused and unreliable. The psychological toll of their fugitive existence was severe. Sarah developed chronic insomnia and paranoid tendencies that made it difficult to maintain normal social interactions. She saw signs of the entity's influence everywhere, in unexplained coincidences, in the behavior of animals, in the quality of light at certain times of day. Some of these perceptions were undoubtedly accurate, but others were likely products of the stress and isolation that had come to define her existence. Mabel's adaptation was more disturbing because it was more successful. The child learned to navigate their nomadic lifestyle with unsettling competence, developing an intuitive understanding of when they needed to move, which routes to take, and how to avoid the entity's more direct manifestations. But this practical wisdom came at the cost of normal emotional development. She formed no friendships, showed little interest in games or activities appropriate to her age, and displayed a fatalistic acceptance of their situation that suggested she had never really expected to live a normal life. The first major crisis in their long exile came in 1935, when Sarah's failing health made it difficult to maintain their constant movement. She had developed a respiratory condition that was likely related to prolonged stress and exposure to harsh living conditions, but which she was convinced was a sign of the entity's increasing influence. They were forced to seek shelter in a charity hospital in Phoenix, where Sarah's inability to provide coherent personal history raised questions that threatened to expose their carefully maintained anonymity. It was during this hospital stay that Mabel, now a young woman of 40, despite her childlike appearance, first spoke openly about their experience in Ash Hollow. She confided in a sympathetic nurse, telling fragments of their story in terms carefully chosen to sound like the delusions of trauma, rather than factual accounts. The nurse, a devout Catholic named Sister Margaret, was moved by what she perceived as a case of religious persecution and helped arrange for Sarah's treatment under a charity program that required minimal documentation. Sister Margaret also provided something that Sarah and Mabel had been lacking for 34 years: a sympathetic listener who didn't immediately dismiss their account as fantasy. The nun had worked extensively with refugees and survivors of religious violence, and she recognized in their story elements that were disturbingly consistent with other cases she had encountered. She couldn't accept the supernatural aspects of their account, but she could see that they had genuinely experienced something traumatic, enough to shatter their sense of identity and safety. Under Sister Margaret's care, Sarah experienced a brief period of relative stability and mental clarity. The hospital's chapel seemed to provide some protection from the entity's influence, and for the first time in decades, she was able to sleep peacefully through entire nights. It was during this respite that she made the decision to create a written record of their experience, not a complete account, which she believed might attract the entity's renewed attention, but a carefully coded narrative that could serve as a warning to others. The document Sarah produced during her hospital stay was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. Written in the form of a religious allegory, it told the story of a community that had sought salvation through the worship of absence and had instead opened a doorway for something ancient and hungry. She changed names, altered dates, and embedded the factual elements within layers of symbolic language that could be interpreted as either theological metaphor or literal history, depending on the reader's perspective. Most importantly, Sarah's account included practical information about the entity's limitations and the methods she and Mabel had developed for avoiding its influence. This information was disguised as spiritual advice about resisting temptation and maintaining faith, but anyone who found themselves in a similar situation would be able to recognize the coded warnings and survival techniques. Sarah died peacefully in the hospital on December 13, 1936, exactly 35 years after the disappearance of Ash Hollow. Her death was attributed to respiratory failure, but Sister Margaret noted that she passed away with an expression of profound relief, as if she had finally been freed from a burden too heavy to carry any longer. Her last words, whispered to Mabel in the moments before her death, were reported to be, "The binding holds, the witness remains. Remember, for both of us now." Mabel's situation after her mother's death was precarious in every possible way. She had no legal identity, no documented history, and no social connections beyond Sister Margaret's limited ability to help. More critically, she was now the sole repository of the complete Ash Hollow story, carrying memories and knowledge that the entity would do anything to reclaim or destroy. Without Sarah's protection and guidance, she was vulnerable to influences that had been held at bay for 3.5 decades. The solution came from an unexpected source. Sister Margaret had shared portions of Sarah's written account with other members of her religious community, describing it as an interesting example of folk theology from the frontier period. The document eventually reached Father Miguel Santos, a Jesuit scholar who specialized in the history of heretical movements in the American Southwest. Father Santos recognized elements in Sarah's allegory that corresponded to actual historical accounts of similar communities, and he began to suspect that the document contained factual information rather than purely fictional content. Father Santos arranged to meet with Mabel, ostensibly to discuss her mother's writings, but actually to assess whether there might be truth behind the elaborate symbolic structure. What he found was a woman who appeared to be in her early 20s, but claimed to be 41, who possessed detailed knowledge of historical events she was too young to have witnessed, and who showed signs of psychological trauma consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme religious practices. More convincing still were the physical effects that Mabel's presence seemed to have on the environment around her. Electronic equipment malfunctioned in her vicinity. Photographs taken of her would develop with strange distortions or blank spaces. Most tellingly, she could provide specific details about the theological writings of Ezekiel Thornton, writings that Father Santos had encountered in his research into 19th century American heresies, but which were not part of any publicly available record. Father Santos's investigation led him to the sealed files of the Ash Hollow Inquiry, which he was able to access through connections within the federal government's Bureau of Indian Affairs. Reading the investigators' reports confirmed many of the details in Sarah's allegorical account and provided additional evidence that something genuinely anomalous had occurred in the Oklahoma Territory in 1901, but it also revealed that the case had been deliberately buried under layers of bureaucratic secrecy. suggesting that official authorities had concluded it posed some ongoing threat to public safety. The decision Father Santos made would shape the remainder of Mabel's life and ultimately determine how the Ash Hollow story would be remembered by subsequent generations. Rather than exposing the case publicly or attempting to investigate it further, he chose to provide Mabel with sanctuary within the Catholic Church's extensive network of missions and monasteries. She would be given a new identity and a safe place to live, in exchange for agreeing never to discuss her experiences outside of carefully controlled circumstances. Mabel accepted this arrangement. Though her motivations were complex, she undoubtedly craved the safety and stability that the Church could provide. But she also seemed to understand that her role as the sole witness to Ash Hollow's fate carried responsibilities that transcended her personal welfare. The entity that had consumed 13 families was still contained within the valley, but that containment was not permanent. Someone needed to remember the story, to preserve the knowledge that might be needed if the binding ever failed. The monastery where Mabel spent the remainder of her life was located in the mountains of New Mexico, far from the Oklahoma Territory, but still within the geographical range where the entity's influence might potentially manifest. The monastery of San Miguel de las Montagas had been established in 1898 as a refuge for those seeking to escape the violence and upheaval of the territorial period, and its isolated location made it an ideal sanctuary for someone carrying secrets as dangerous as Mabel's. Life within the monastery's walls provided Mabel with the structure and protection she had lacked since childhood, but it also imposed new challenges. The other residents, a mix of nuns, lay workers, and refugees from various conflicts, were curious about the strange young woman who aged so slowly and spoke so rarely. Father Santos had provided her with a cover story about religious persecution and traumatic memory loss, but maintaining this deception required constant vigilance. More difficult still was the entity's continued pursuit. The monastery's consecrated ground provided some protection, but Mabel could feel the presence lurking just beyond the boundaries of sacred space, probing for weaknesses in the spiritual barriers that held it at bay. The 13th day of each month remained particularly dangerous, requiring her to remain within the chapel or other blessed areas where the entity's influence was weakest. The monks and nuns gradually adapted to Mabel's peculiar requirements, interpreting them as the products of deep religious trauma rather than supernatural necessity. Her insistence on sleeping in the chapel was seen as excessive piety. Her ability to predict when electronic equipment would malfunction was attributed to sensitivity developed through years of persecution. Her occasional episodes of speaking in unknown languages were dismissed as glossolalia brought on by intense prayer. But Father Santos knew better, and he began a careful study of Mabel's condition that would continue for more than a decade. Working with scholars from universities across the Southwest, he documented the physical and psychological effects of her prolonged exposure to the entity's influence. The research was necessarily covert, conducted under the guise of studying religious trauma and frontier psychology, but it produced the most comprehensive analysis of supernatural contamination ever assembled by academic authorities. The findings were both fascinating and terrifying. Mabel's cellular structure showed signs of temporal distortion that prevented normal aging processes. Her brain exhibited electromagnetic patterns unlike anything in medical literature, suggesting that her consciousness had been fundamentally altered by prolonged contact with non-human intelligence. Most disturbing of all, her presence seemed to create localized distortions in the fabric of reality itself. Subtle changes in probability, causality, and the behavior of physical laws that could only be detected through careful measurement and statistical analysis. These studies also revealed that Mabel's condition was slowly deteriorating. The entity's influence, held at bay but never fully banished, was gradually consuming the aspects of her humanity that had allowed her to resist absorption. For so many years, Father Santos estimated that she had perhaps 2 decades before the process reached a critical threshold, after which she would either die or become something no longer recognizably human. This prognosis led to an urgent decision about how to preserve the knowledge Mabel carried. Father Santos began conducting extensive interviews with her, recording her memories and experiences in exhaustive detail. But the process was complicated by the ongoing memory loss that had plagued her since childhood. Crucial details would fade even as she spoke them, and attempts to create permanent records were frustrated by the same forces that had prevented investigators from properly documenting the original Ash Hollow ledger. The solution came through collaboration with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a psychiatrist and anthropologist who had been studying indigenous folklore about similar entities throughout the American Southwest. Dr. Vasquez had encountered stories from multiple tribal communities describing encounters with beings that fed on silence and grew stronger through the absence of prayer or attention. These entities, known by various names but sharing consistent characteristics, seemed to represent a widespread phenomenon that had been affecting human communities for centuries. Working together, Father Santos and Dr. Vasquez developed a method for preserving Mabel's account that took advantage of the entity's own limitations. Rather than creating a single comprehensive record that the entity could target for destruction, they fragmented the information across multiple documents, each containing only partial details but all sharing common symbolic elements that would allow a dedicated researcher to reconstruct the complete story. These documents were then distributed to archives, libraries, and private collections throughout North America and Europe, disguised as academic papers, folklore collections, and historical analyses. The strategy was based on the observation that the entity seemed unable to simultaneously monitor multiple widely separated locations, and that its influence was weakest when information was embedded within larger bodies of legitimate scholarship. The project consumed the final years of Mabel's coherent existence. By 1945, she was experiencing periods of dissociation that lasted for days at a time, during which she would speak in the voices of the 13 families who had perished in Ash Hollow. These episodes provided additional details about the original community and the circumstances of their disappearance, but they also indicated that Mabel's individual consciousness was being gradually absorbed into the collective entity that had consumed the town. Father Santos documented these episodes with scientific precision, recognizing them as potentially the last direct communication from the victims of the Ash Hollow disappearance. The personalities that emerged during Mabel's dissociative states were consistent and detailed, providing information about daily life in the community that could not have been fabricated. They spoke of their growing awareness of the entity's true nature, their desperate attempts to find an alternative to the sacrificial pact, and their final moments of terror and resignation. As the ritual reached its climax, most valuable of all were the technical details about the entity itself that emerged during these sessions. The absorbed personalities retained knowledge of the creature's limitations, its methods of manifestation, and the specific conditions required for containing or banishing it. This information was carefully recorded and incorporated into the distributed documentation network, creating a comprehensive manual for dealing with similar entities should they manifest elsewhere. The end came suddenly in March of 1947. Mabel had been experiencing a particularly intense dissociative episode, cycling through the personalities of all 13 family leaders in rapid succession, when she suddenly returned to her own consciousness with perfect clarity. For the first time in years, she seemed fully present and aware, speaking in her own voice about her own experiences rather than channeling the memories of the dead. She used this final moment of clarity to provide Father Santos with the location of additional caches that she and her mother had hidden during their decades of flight. These caches contained personal documents, photographs, and artifacts from Ash Hollow that had been preserved as insurance against the complete erasure of the community's history. Most importantly, they contained copies of Ezekiel Thorne's original theological writings, documents that provided crucial insight into the philosophical framework that had made the entity's manifestation possible. Mabel's death occurred during the early hours of March 13, 1947, exactly 46 years after the disappearance of Ash Hollow. Unlike her mother's peaceful passing, Mabel's death was violent and disturbing. She was found in the monastery chapel, her body positioned as if she had been reaching toward the altar, her expression frozen in a mixture of terror and defiance. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but witnesses reported that her final moments had been accompanied by temperature drops, electromagnetic disturbances, and the sound of whispered voices speaking in unison. More disturbing still were the changes that occurred in her body after death. Rather than following normal decomposition processes, Mabel's remains seemed to fade gradually, becoming translucent and insubstantial over the course of several days. By the time arrangements could be made for burial, there was nothing left but an outline on the chapel floor, a shadow without substance that persisted for months before finally disappearing entirely. Father Santos interpreted these phenomena as evidence that Mabel had finally been fully absorbed by the entity, her individual existence erased in the same manner as the 13 families of Ash Hollow. But he also believed that her long resistance had served its purpose, providing enough time to create the distributed record that would preserve the story for future generations. The knowledge needed to recognize and combat similar entities had been successfully embedded within the broader stream of human scholarship, disguised but accessible to those who knew how to look for it. The decades following Mabel's death saw periodic attempts to investigate the Ash Hollow site directly. Archaeological expeditions in the 1950s and 1960s found evidence of the original settlement foundation stones, metal artifacts, and the remains of the inverted church that had served as the community's spiritual center. But these investigations were consistently plagued by equipment failures, personnel difficulties, and bureaucratic obstacles that suggested ongoing interference from federal authorities. More successful were the indirect approaches developed by researchers who had access to portions of the distributed documentation network. By cross-referencing folklore, historical records, and scientific anomalies, they were able to identify dozens of similar cases throughout American history, communities that had vanished without explanation, religious movements that had developed, dangerous theological innovations, and geographical locations that seemed to resist human habitation for unexplained reasons. This research revealed that the Ash Hollow incident was not unique, but rather part of a larger pattern of entity manifestations that had been occurring throughout the colonial and territorial periods. The common elements were consistent across time and geography: communities that developed theologies based on absence or negation, rituals that involved prolonged silence or sensory deprivation, and locations where mineral deposits or geological features created natural conditions conducive to supernatural manifestation. Most disturbing of all was the evidence suggesting that these manifestations were becoming more frequent and more successful as human population density increased. The entities seemed to feed on the spiritual emptiness created by urbanization and technological advancement, growing stronger in environments where traditional religious and community structures had been weakened or abandoned. The Ash Hollow entity, successfully contained within its Oklahoma Valley, represented an early and relatively minor example of a phenomenon that might eventually threaten human civilization itself. This realization led to the formation of informal networks of researchers, religious leaders, and government officials who shared information about supernatural threats and coordinated responses to potential manifestations. These networks operated without official sanction, funded through private donations and academic grants, but they maintained connections to military and intelligence agencies that could provide resources when direct intervention became necessary. The most significant test of these informal networks came in 1963, when geological surveys detected anomalous readings in the Ash Hollow Valley that suggested the entity's containment might be weakening. The readings were subtle, slight changes in magnetic field strength, minor temperature variations, and electromagnetic emissions that required sophisticated equipment to detect. But researchers familiar with the historical patterns recognized them as early warning signs of potential breakthrough. The response was swift and coordinated. Teams of specialists converged on the area under the cover of a routine archaeological survey, bringing equipment designed to reinforce the spiritual and physical barriers that held the entity in check. The operation required careful coordination between scientific and religious elements, combining electromagnetic field generators with consecrated materials, psychological warfare techniques with traditional exorcism rituals. The intervention was successful, but barely. The entity had indeed been testing the boundaries of its containment, probing for weaknesses that might allow it to expand beyond the valley, or to communicate with potential followers in the outside world. The reinforcement efforts managed to strengthen the barriers and reset the containment cycle, but they also provided clear evidence that the original binding was not permanent and would require periodic maintenance to remain effective. This discovery fundamentally changed the approach to managing the Ash Hollow threat. Rather than relying on passive containment, the informal networks began developing active monitoring and intervention protocols. Permanent observation posts were established at strategic locations around the valley, disguised as weather stations, radio towers, and agricultural research facilities. Personnel were rotated frequently to prevent prolonged exposure to the entity's influence, and all observers were required to undergo psychological screening and spiritual preparation. Before assignment, the monitoring revealed that the entity's activity followed predictable cycles related to astronomical events, geological conditions, and human population patterns in the surrounding region. Major solar storms would cause temporary increases in manifestation attempts. Seismic activity in the region would create opportunities for the entity to test its physical boundaries. Most significantly, periods of social upheaval or religious conflict in nearby communities would provide the spiritual energy that the entity needed to strengthen itself against its containment. These observations led to the development of countermeasures designed to disrupt the entity's cycles. Before they could reach critical thresholds, weather modification techniques were employed to alter electromagnetic conditions in the valley. During vulnerable periods, seismic monitoring allowed for early warning of geological events that might weaken containment. Barriers, most importantly, community outreach programs were developed to strengthen religious and social cohesion in surrounding areas, denying the entity the spiritual vacuum it needed to feed and grow. But the most crucial element of the ongoing containment effort was the preservation and expansion of the historical record. Each generation of researchers added new details to the distributed documentation network, incorporating advances in psychology, physics, and theology that provided better understanding of the entity's nature and limitations. The story of Ash Hollow was gradually transformed from historical curiosity into operational manual, a guide for recognizing and responding to similar threats wherever they might appear. The network also served as a memorial to the 13 families who had sacrificed themselves to contain the entity, and to Sarah and Mabel Whitmore, who had preserved the knowledge needed to maintain that containment. Their names were embedded within the documentation and forms that would resist the entity's attempts at erasure, ensuring that their courage and sacrifice would be remembered, even if their individual identities continued to fade from conventional historical records. As the 20th century drew to a close, researchers began to notice disturbing trends that suggested the Ash Hollow containment might face unprecedented challenges in the decades ahead. Global communication networks created opportunities for the entity to influence susceptible individuals across vast distances. The decline of traditional religious institutions left growing numbers of people vulnerable to alternative spiritual movements that might unknowingly recreate the conditions that had allowed the original manifestation. Most ominously, environmental changes in the valley itself suggested that climate shifts and geological processes might eventually compromise the physical barriers that supplemented the spiritual containment. These concerns led to increasingly sophisticated contingency planning for scenarios ranging from gradual containment failure to catastrophic breakthrough. Evacuation protocols were developed for surrounding communities. Emergency response teams were trained in containment and banishment techniques. Most importantly, the distributed documentation network was expanded to include detailed instructions for recreating the containment from scratch, ensuring that the knowledge would survive even if the original barriers were completely destroyed. The planning also addressed the possibility that containment might ultimately prove impossible, requiring more drastic measures to prevent the entity's spread. These measures included everything from nuclear sterilization of the valley Two complex rituals designed to redirect the entity's attention toward uninhabited dimensions. The ethical implications of such extreme responses generated extensive debate within the informal networks, but the consensus was clear: the threat posed by an uncontained entity justified almost any sacrifice necessary to prevent its escape. As the new millennium began, the Ash Hollow monitoring stations detected the first signs of what would become known as the resonance crisis, a period of increased entity activity that seemed to be triggered by the approach of significant calendar dates. The year 2001 would mark the centennial of the original disappearance, and researchers feared that this anniversary might provide the entity with sufficient symbolic power to overcome its containment entirely. The crisis began subtly, with minor equipment malfunctions at monitoring stations and reports of unusual dreams among personnel assigned to the project. But by the spring of 2001, the manifestations had escalated to include physical phenomena that could no longer be attributed to natural causes. Temperature anomalies in the valley began to form geometric patterns that matched the ritual circles described in Ezekiel Thorne's writings. Electromagnetic readings showed regular pulses that corresponded to the breathing patterns used in the community's original silence rituals. Most disturbing of all were the reports from surrounding communities of individuals who claimed to be receiving telepathic communications from the entity. These individuals, invariably people with histories of religious instability or psychological vulnerability, described dreams and visions that provided detailed knowledge of the Ash Hollow story despite having no previous exposure to the historical records. They spoke of 13 families calling to them from beyond death, inviting them to complete the work that had been interrupted a century earlier. The response to the resonance crisis required unprecedented coordination between the various elements of the informal networks. Religious authorities from multiple denominations contributed personnel and resources to a massive ritual working designed to reinforce the spiritual containment. Government agencies provided logistical support and maintained security cordons around the affected area. Scientific teams deployed advanced monitoring equipment to track the entity's manifestation. Attempts in real time. The climax came on October 13, 2001, exactly 100 years after the original Pact of Sacred Sacrifice. Monitoring stations detected massive energy releases from the valley as the entity made its most determined attempt yet to break free from containment. The reinforcement teams reported visual manifestations of the absorbed families, appearing as shadows and whispers that pleaded for release from their century of imprisonment. The entity itself briefly achieved partial physical manifestation, creating a zone of absolute silence and darkness at the center of the valley that seemed to exist outside normal spacetime. The battle for that was what it truly was lasted from sunset to sunrise, with the containment forces gradually gaining ground as the anniversary moment passed and the entity's symbolic power began to wane. By dawn on October 14th, the immediate crisis had passed, but the effort had required such massive expenditure of resources and personnel that it became clear the informal networks were no longer adequate to handle the threat. The aftermath of the resonance crisis led to the first official government acknowledgement of the Ash Hollow situation. Since the original territorial investigation, a classified program was established within the Department of Homeland Security, providing official funding and authority for ongoing containment efforts. The program operated under multiple cover identities and bureaucratic shells, but it finally gave the researchers and containment specialists the resources they needed to maintain effective oversight of the entity. The official program also allowed for more sophisticated research into the entity's nature and the development of advanced containment technologies. Scientists working with clearances that allowed them access to the complete historical record made rapid progress in understanding the physics of supernatural manifestation and the psychological mechanisms through which entities influenced human behavior. This research led to the development of containment methods that were far more reliable than the original spiritual barriers, though they still required constant maintenance and periodic reinforcement. But perhaps the most important development following the resonance crisis was the decision to create a complete and unredacted historical record of the Ash Hollow incident. For exactly 1 century, the story had been fragmented and disguised to prevent the entity from targeting the information for destruction. Now, with advanced containment in place and official support for ongoing monitoring, it became possible to assemble the full account for the first time since Sarah Whitmore's allegorical narrative. This complete record served multiple purposes. It provided researchers with the comprehensive understanding needed to predict and prevent future manifestation attempts. It honored the memory of all those who had been consumed or transformed by the entity's influence. Most importantly, it served as a warning and guide for future generations who might encounter similar threats. In an increasingly complex and connected world, the story of Ash Hollow, as it finally emerged from a century of concealment and fragmentation, was far more complex and disturbing than even the most dedicated researchers had realized. The entity that had consumed 13 families was not a singular anomaly, but part of a vast ecosystem of supernatural predators that had been feeding on human communities since the dawn of civilization. The theological innovations of Ezekiel Thorne had not created this entity, but had merely provided it with an opportunity to manifest more fully in the physical world. The 13 families who had signed the Pact of Sacred Sacrifice had not been deceived victims, but willing participants in a bargain that they understood would cost them their individual existence. They had chosen absorption over abandonment of their community, hoping that their sacrifice would provide meaning to lives that had been marked by persecution and displacement. In the end, their choice had indeed served a greater purpose, containing a threat that might otherwise have spread throughout the rapidly expanding American frontier. Sarah and Mabel Whitmore had served as more than witnesses to the community's fate. Their decades of exile and resistance had provided crucial time for human society to develop the scientific and organizational capabilities needed to understand and contain supernatural threats. Their suffering had not been meaningless but had been the price of preserving knowledge that would prove essential to human survival in an age when ancient predators were awakening to feed on modern spiritual emptiness. The complete record also revealed that the Ash Hollow entity remained active and dangerous despite its containment. The barriers that held it in place were artificial constraints that required constant energy and attention to maintain. The entity was patient and intelligent, constantly probing for weaknesses and adapting its strategies to take advantage of changing conditions in the outside world. It had not been defeated, but merely delayed, waiting for the opportunity to complete the work it had begun in 1901. Most ominously, the record suggested that the entity was not unique. Similar manifestations had been documented throughout human history, and the conditions that allowed for supernatural predation were becoming more common rather than less. The spiritual vacuum created by urbanization, technological dependence, and social fragmentation provided ideal feeding grounds for entities that thrived on absence and negation. The Ash Hollow incident might prove to be merely the first of many such manifestations. In the modern era, this realization led to the expansion of the containment program into a broader initiative focused on identifying and preventing supernatural manifestations before they could achieve the level of development seen in Ash Hollow. Teams of researchers began investigating communities that showed the warning signs associated with entity influence, unusual religious practices, unexplained disappearances, areas of persistent electromagnetic disturbance, and locations where traditional spiritual practices had been abandoned or corrupted. The work was necessarily covert and often controversial. Interventions had to be subtle enough to avoid attracting public attention, while being effective enough to disrupt dangerous spiritual practices before they could mature into full manifestations. The program operated through a network of religious leaders, mental health professionals, and community organizers who could address the underlying conditions that made communities vulnerable to supernatural predation. Success stories were necessarily invisible communities that never developed dangerous practices, religious movements that were guided toward constructive rather than destructive innovations, geographical areas where natural containment barriers were strengthened before they could be breached, The program's effectiveness could only be measured by the absence of incidents like Ash Hollow, a negative proof that was difficult to document or celebrate. But the failures were all too visible to those with access to the classified records. Despite the best efforts of the containment teams, new manifestations continued to occur with disturbing regularity. Most were contained quickly through rapid intervention, but each incident demonstrated that the underlying threat was growing. Rather than diminishing, the entities were learning from each encounter, developing more sophisticated methods of manifestation and more effective techniques for avoiding detection. The pattern that emerged from decades of incident reports was deeply troubling. The entities were not random supernatural phenomena, but organized predators operating according to complex strategies designed to maximize their feeding opportunities while minimizing the risk of effective human response. They shared information across vast distances and coordinated their activities to create cascading crises that could overwhelm containment resources. Most ominously, they seemed to be preparing for something larger, a coordinated breakthrough that would allow them to establish permanent footholds in the physical world. This preparation phase appeared to be accelerating as the 21st century progressed. The global communication networks that had revolutionized human society also provided unprecedented opportunities for entities to influence susceptible individuals. Across vast distances, social media platforms became vectors for the subtle psychological manipulation that entities used to prepare communities for manifestation. Online religious movements could be corrupted or guided toward dangerous practices without the natural safeguards that had historically protected traditional communities. The response to these evolving threats required constant adaptation and expansion of containment capabilities. The original focus on geographical monitoring had to be supplemented with cyber surveillance, systems designed to detect supernatural influence in digital communications. Traditional religious and psychological intervention techniques had to be updated to address the unique vulnerabilities created by modern technology and social structures. But the most significant challenge facing the containment program was the gradual erosion of the knowledge base that had made effective response possible. The researchers and religious leaders who had developed the original understanding of supernatural manifestation were aging and retiring, taking with them experiential knowledge that could not be easily transmitted to younger colleagues. The informal networks that had preserved and expanded the historical record were being replaced by official bureaucracies that prioritized security over scholarship. Most critically, the complete record of the Ash Hollow incident, the comprehensive account that had finally been assembled after a century of fragmentation, was once again being classified and restricted to prevent public awareness of the supernatural threat. While this security was necessary to prevent panic and copycat incidents, it also meant that each new generation of containment personnel had to rediscover lessons that had already been learned at tremendous cost. The cyclical nature of this knowledge, loss and recovery, suggested that humanity was trapped in a pattern that favored the entities over their human opponents. Each generation had to relearn the same fundamental truths about supernatural manifestation, often through direct encounter with active threats. The entities, by contrast, retained perfect memory of their interactions with human society and could build upon centuries of accumulated experience. Breaking this cycle required a fundamental change in approach, the development of permanent institutions and knowledge preservation systems that could maintain continuity across generations while adapting to evolving threats. The challenge was creating such systems without exposing them to the same vulnerabilities that had historically allowed entities to corrupt or destroy human organizations from within. The solution, when it finally emerged, drew inspiration from the distributed documentation network that had preserved the Ash Hollow story through its century of concealment. Rather than relying on centralized institutions that could be targeted for corruption or destruction, the new approach involved embedding essential knowledge within the broader structure of human civilization itself. Universities, religious institutions, government agencies, and private organizations all carried portions of the complete picture, with no single entity possessing enough information to pose a security risk. but all contributing to a collective understanding that could respond effectively to supernatural threats. This distributed approach had its own vulnerabilities and limitations, but it offered the best hope for maintaining effective containment capabilities across the generational timescales required to manage supernatural threats. The Ash Hollow entity, contained but not destroyed, would require active monitoring and periodic reinforcement for the foreseeable future. Similar entities would continue to manifest as human society evolved and created new opportunities for supernatural predation. The knowledge needed to recognize and respond to these threats had to be preserved and transmitted with the same persistence and dedication that the entities themselves brought to their feeding strategies. The story of Ash Hollow, in its complete and unredacted form, served as both historical record and operational manual for this ongoing struggle. It documented the price of spiritual vacancy and theological innovation without wisdom. It honored the sacrifice of those who had chosen absorption over abandonment. It preserved the techniques developed through decades of desperate resistance and careful research. Most importantly, it served as a warning that the threat was real, ongoing, and patient enough to outlast any single human generation. In the end, the 13 families who had signed the Pact of Sacred Sacrifice had achieved a form of immortality through their willing absorption into the entity that consumed their community. Their individual identities had been erased, but their collective sacrifice continued to serve the greater purpose of containing a threat that might otherwise have consumed countless other communities. They remained conscious within the entity's structure, aware of their situation, but unable to communicate directly with the outside world except through the brief manifestations that occurred during containment crises. Sarah and Mabel Whitmore had achieved their own form of immortality through the preservation of their story and the techniques they had developed for resisting supernatural influence. Their names might fade from conventional historical records, but their methods and insights had been embedded within the containment protocols that protected human civilization from ongoing supernatural predation. Every successful intervention, every prevented manifestation, every community guided away from dangerous spiritual practices honored their memory and continued their work. The complete record of Ash Hollow stood as testimony to the fact that human beings, despite their individual frailty and the brevity of their lives, could successfully resist threats that operated on supernatural timescales. The key was not individual heroism, but collective memory, institutional continuity, and the willingness to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term survival. The battle against supernatural predation would continue for as long as human civilization existed, but it was a battle that could be won through persistent effort and shared dedication to preserving the knowledge needed for effective resistance. The ledger that Bernard Kessel had discovered in the abandoned church of Ash Hollow remained in its climate-controlled archive, its 13th page still blank despite decades of attempts to complete the ritual that would release the entity from its containment. The page waited, patient and ready, for the signature that would mark the final failure of human resistance to supernatural predation. But that failure had not come, would not come as long as the story was remembered and the knowledge preserved. The binding held, the witness remained, and the covenant of resistance continued across the generations, written not in ink but in dedication, sacrifice, and the stubborn human refusal to surrender hope even in the face of impossible odds. The silence of Ash Hollow still spoke to those who knew how to listen, but it no longer spoke of despair and abandonment. It spoke of sacrifice willingly made, of knowledge carefully preserved, and of resistance that transcended individual mortality to become part of the eternal human struggle against the darkness that sought to consume not just lives but the very meaning of existence itself. In that struggle, every voice raised in defiance mattered, every act of preservation had value, and every generation that successfully passed the knowledge to their successors achieved a victory that echoed across time. The covenant was sealed, but it was sealed not in surrender but in determination. The 13th family lived on, not in the flesh but in the spirit of resistance that animated all those who took up the burden of protecting human civilization from threats that most would never recognize or understand. The witness remained, multiplied across thousands of individuals who carried fragments of the complete story, each one a guardian of knowledge too important to be lost and too dangerous to be widely known. In the end, that was the true legacy of Ash Hollow, not the warning of what could happen when communities lost their way in the darkness, but the promise of what could be achieved when individuals chose to stand against impossible odds for the sake of those who would come after them. The story continued, written in new voices with each passing generation, but always carrying forward the essential truth that even the most powerful supernatural predators could be contained by human will, human knowledge, and human love expressed through the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. The Pact endured, transformed from an instrument of surrender into a weapon of resistance.